The non-renewal letter was 2 paragraphs long. I sealed it on a Tuesday morning, initialed the cover sheet the way I did with every piece of outgoing correspondence, and set it in the mail tray beside my coffee cup. Nobody in that office looked up. Nobody asked what it was. It was an administrative document in a building full of administrative documents, and I walked back to my desk, opened the next file in my queue, and finished my coffee before it went cold. That was 3 months after my mother, Renata Voss, called me on a Thursday evening in April to tell me that my 9-year-old son, Jonah, was not the right fit for the summer enrichment program she had paid for, $850 per child, for all 6 of her other grandchildren, for everyone except him. This story starts the night she made that call. But before I get to that, you need to know who I am and what I do for a living, because it matters in a way that is going to take the whole story to explain. My name is Gemma Holt. I am 38 years old, and for the last 7 years I have administered curriculum development grants for the Arborfield Unified School District. My job is to read applications, run compliance checks, apply a prioritization rubric to a fixed annual budget, and decide which programs receive public funding and which ones don't. I know every program operating in this district. I know their financials, their participant demographics, their curriculum structures, their fee models, and the strength of their public benefit case. When a program applies for district grant money, every line of that application passes through my desk and my determination. My mother knew I worked in the district office. She thought that meant scheduling and administrative support. In 10 years, she had never once asked me what the paperwork was for. Renata Voss delivered her news about Jonah the way she delivered difficult information generally, not coldly, not dramatically, but with a particular kind of administrative calm, as if she were reading a bus schedule to someone who had asked what time the 4:15 ran. She said she had paid the Maplecrest Academic Summer Enrichment fees for all 6 grandchildren this year as a gift. She said it as if this were the pleasant part of the call, and I suppose for her it was. Then she said that for Jonah, she wasn't sure the program was the right fit. It was selective, he tended to be a lot. She thought the structured environment might be stressful for him. $850 per child, 6 grandchildren, Jonah was the 7th. I sat in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and listened to the refrigerator cycle on and off and my son's sneakers squeak on the tile in the next room, and I said, very calmly, "Okay, Mom," 2 words. That was the complete extent of my response. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that the Maplecrest Academic Summer Enrichment Program had submitted an application for a district matching grant 11 weeks earlier. The application was already in my review queue. I had already read the first pass of it. 3 months after that phone call, my sister Claudia called me on a Thursday morning in a state of controlled alarm. The program director had sent a letter to all enrolled families. The fall academic preparation session was suspended. The district matching grant had not been renewed. Without the supplemental funding, the program's curriculum budget had been reduced to the point where its centerpiece module could not run. And nobody thought to look at the curriculum grants administrator sitting 2 zip codes away, in the building where the decision had been made on a Tuesday morning that looked like any other Tuesday. Welcome back. If you have been here before, you know this is a space for stories about women who do the quiet work and let it arrive where it needs to go without announcing itself. If patient, precise justice is the kind of story you can sit with for an hour, you are in exactly the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from. I read every one of them, and I will tell you right now, they come from everywhere. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. These stories take their time, and you don't want to arrive at the end without having been here for the middle. Let me back up. My parents raised 4 children in Arborfield, Ohio. My oldest brother Marcus, then me, then my sister Claudia, then my youngest brother Derek. The Voss household was organized around a set of unspoken rules that I had spent most of my adult life learning to name after years of simply absorbing their effects. The rules were not cruel in any theatrical way. They were the other kind of not fair. The kind that runs on a ledger nobody signs but everyone secretly keeps. The kind where the columns never add up the same way for everyone at the table. Marcus was the firstborn son, which in my mother's accounting meant he received the most considered investments. Not just money, attention, credibility, the assumption of capability that precedes any evidence of it. Claudia was the one who had married well, whose house had the right square footage, whose children arrived at family gatherings clean and photogenic and able to sit quietly when required. Derek was the youngest and therefore treated with a tenderness that passed for concern, but functioned as protection from accountability. And I was the capable middle child, which in Voss family terms meant I was the one who could be relied upon to handle her own affairs. This was framed as a compliment. It functioned as a standing permission slip to overlook me. My husband Sean coaches high school basketball and teaches physical education at Arborfield High, 4 miles from the district office where I work. We have been married 11 years. He is the most straightforward person I have ever known, which I mean as the highest possible compliment, because in a family like the Voss family, straightforward people are a relief so profound it can move you to tears if you let it. Our son Jonah is 9 years old, and he is the most specific person in our household, which is remarkable given that I color-code my grant compliance calendar and organize my file cabinet alphabetically by funding category. Jonah does not like things generally. He likes certain books at specific chapters, the edge pieces of puzzles exclusively, and the children's librarian at the Arborfield Public Library named Addie Barrow, who lets him use her personal stapler whenever he brings a project that needs it. He carries his library card in his jacket pocket with the readiness of someone who might need to present credentials at any moment, because in Jonah's daily life, access to library materials is a kind of credential that matters. The card was already beginning to wear thin at the corners from use before any of this story happened. We were not the Voss family's favorite branch. We had not been the favorite branch for as long as I could remember, and I had spent years not naming it, because naming it would mean deciding what to do about it, and I was busy enough keeping my own life organized. Marcus had 2 children, Tasha, who was 12, and Cole, who was 8. Claudia had Lily, 11, and Sam, 9. Sam was exactly Jonah's age and had attended the same school until Claudia's family moved to the newer neighborhood on the other side of the district boundary. Derek had one daughter, Brianne, who was 7 and had recently developed a passionate interest in horses that my mother was very pleased about and funded with a riding lesson subscription, 6 grandchildren total. Jonah was the 7th, and the odd number in the count told its own quiet story about how the Voss family thought about its family tree. The history of the ledger started long before the Maplecrest call. I had been cataloging it for years, in the way that careful people catalog things they are not yet ready to act on. When Tasha was 9 and expressed an interest in astronomy, my parents had bought her a telescope, a real one, not a toy, the kind with a tripod stand and adjustable focus. When Jonah was 8 and told my mother at a family dinner that he wanted to build a robot someday, she had said, "How fun," and given him a $20 gift card to a bookstore for Christmas. I did not write these things down at the time, but the balance was accumulating. The Christmas before the Maplecrest call, my mother had taken Claudia's 2 children on a shopping afternoon. Just the 3 of them, she said. They were at such a fun age. Sam was 9. Jonah was 9. He was at home with Sean that afternoon, putting together a puzzle of the Pacific Flyway migration routes that he had chosen from the library's puzzle lending program because he had been interested in migratory birds since he noticed one in the backyard that he couldn't identify. My mother told me about the shopping afternoon on the phone, cheerfully, as if reporting a piece of pleasant news. She did not seem to notice that she had not invited Jonah. Or, she noticed and had decided his exclusion was so natural it did not require comment. I said, "That sounds nice, Mom." I was good at "that sounds nice." The Maplecrest Academic Summer Enrichment program ran every summer in a converted church fellowship hall in the eastern part of Arborfield. The facility was clean, well organized, and staffed by a former high school debate coach named Philip Oakes, who had built the program over 6 years from an informal reading group into something that parents with children on its waiting list considered genuinely competitive. 8 weeks in summer. The curriculum covered logic, critical thinking, academic writing, and a module on basic legal structures, how contracts worked, how to read a document, how to understand the terms of an agreement you were asked to sign. The program cost $850 per child. My mother called on a Thursday in April. The dinner dishes were done. Jonah was at the kitchen table reading a library book about bird migration that he had checked out himself, voluntarily, because of the backyard bird he still hadn't identified. I wanted to let you know, my mother said, that I paid the Maplecrest fees this year as a gift for all the grandchildren. She paused in the precise place where difficult information lives. For Jonah, I wasn't as sure. The program is quite selective, and he can be a lot in structured environments. I thought it might create more pressure than it was worth. Jonah turned a page. The refrigerator cycled. I watched the back of his head and thought about the 45 minutes he had spent at a backyard barbecue the previous summer, explaining the nitrogen cycle to my mother's neighbor, who had mentioned having a brown lawn, and then found herself in a detailed and organized and completely accurate tutorial delivered by an 8-year-old who could not leave an open question alone. My mother had called that episode a lot to keep up with. She was not wrong. She had simply drawn the wrong conclusion from it. "Okay, Mom," I said. She waited. I think she expected an argument. An argument would have been easier for her, because it would have given her something to refuse. My "okay, Mom" took the form of the conversation she was prepared for and made it into something else. I could hear her recalibrating, slightly, before she said she hoped Jonah had a nice summer anyway, and we hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after the call. Jonah asked me if everything was okay. I told him yes. He showed me a page in his book, a diagram of the American kestrel's range map, and told me he was pretty sure that was what he had seen in the backyard. The tail markings matched, he said. He had been tracking the evidence for 3 weeks. I told him that sounded right to me. I did not think about the grant file for 2 days. I had been in the middle of a complex cycle with 14 applications in various stages of review, and the Maplecrest file had been in the queue since late February, in the complete, pending second review category. It was not flagged. It was not urgent. On the Saturday after my mother's call, I opened it for the second read. The program had served 42 students in the prior session. 38 of those students were currently enrolled in the Arborfield Unified School District. The district's matching grant, if awarded, would cover approximately 38% of the program's operating budget, curriculum licensing, the resource library, a portion of instructor compensation. I read the public benefit section the way I read every public benefit section, looking for the specific evidence that the program served district families who needed subsidization, not just families who could afford private tuition on their own. The district's grant mandate required demonstrable benefit to enrolled students, with prioritization given to programs that extended access beyond families who could independently fund the program's cost. The Maplecrest demographic breakdown was in the appendix. I opened it. Of the 38 district-enrolled participants in the prior session, 31 came from households above the district's free and reduced lunch eligibility threshold. The program had no sliding scale fee option. It had no documented scholarship fund. It had no formal outreach to economically underserved families in the district. Its application made the case for its academic quality, which was real, but it did not make the case that public money was necessary to make the program accessible to district families who could not otherwise afford it. I made a note in the file. I did not make a grant decision that evening. I was not finished reviewing the other 13 applications. The grant decision would be made when I had completed all reviews, applied the rubric consistently to each file, and ranked the programs by score against the available budget. That was the process. It was the same process every year. I followed it the same way I followed it every year. I should tell you about the month of May, because May was when Jonah found out what his summer would look like, and his response to it is part of this story. I did not tell him about the Maplecrest situation. He was 9 years old and it was not his to carry. What I told him was that we were going to build his summer ourselves, that I had an idea I wanted to run past him, and that it would involve the library. His face, when I said the word library, was the face of a person who has just been told that Christmas is moving to July. Before I called Addie Barrow, I sat down and thought carefully about what Jonah needed. He needed a space where his curiosity was not managed. He needed adults who would follow the question where it led, instead of redirecting it to what the lesson plan required. He needed a community, not a competitive one, but a curious one, other children who found something and could not let it go. That was not the program his cousins were attending, but it was possible, if I built it correctly. Addie Barrow had been the children's librarian at the Arborfield Public Library for 19 years. She was 61 years old and had been running an informal summer reading group for 3 years without institutional support, without a budget line, without any promotion beyond a handwritten sign on the library bulletin board that said, in her even block handwriting, "Curious Children Welcome, Tuesdays and Fridays." No prerequisites. She had 6 children already signed up for the summer when I called her. She said yes before I finished the question. She said she had been looking for an 8th child all spring because the group worked better in even numbers and she did not want Jonah to be odd one out. She said it as if she had been expecting my call, which she had not, but which is the kind of thing that happens when the right person is in the right place at the right time. The children named themselves the Arrowhead Club on the first Tuesday. Jonah had brought his bird photograph, the kestrel from the backyard, printed on regular printer paper in the slightly pixelated way of a 9-year-old's printing decisions, and Addie had identified it immediately, an American kestrel. She explained the forked tail, the way it looked in certain angles of afternoon light, how the field guides described it. The arrowhead, Jonah said, was the thing that made it unmistakable. He said this with the satisfaction of someone who has been pursuing an answer for 6 weeks and has finally arrived at it. That was day 1. June came the way June always does in Ohio, slowly at first, and then all at once. The kind of warmth that arrives apologetically and then refuses to leave. The Maplecrest program started in the 2nd week of June. My mother sent me a photograph from Claudia's backyard of all 6 grandchildren on the first day, Lily and Sam, and Tasha and Cole and Brianne, and Marcus's youngest in a cluster, holding up their program materials. Claudia's message underneath said, "First day was a big success. The kids are so excited." I looked at the photograph for a moment, then I texted back a thumbs up and went to make dinner. The Arrowhead Club met for the first time on a Tuesday in mid-June, 7 children plus Jonah, which made 8. Addie pulled books from the specialty collection that none of these children would have found on their own. Books from the natural sciences section, the reference stacks, the regional history shelves that rarely got touched except by adults doing very specific research. She let the children set the agenda by following their questions instead of setting one herself. The first day they agreed on 3 research threads: migratory birds of the Midwest, watershed ecosystems, and the history of cartography, because one of the children had asked how people made maps before satellites, and nobody, including Addie, knew the full answer, and that was the kind of not knowing that the club could not leave alone. Jonah came home the first Tuesday, unable to stop talking. He explained watershed formation at the dinner table while Sean and I ate our pasta, and nodded and asked questions at the right intervals, and he kept circling back to things he hadn't finished explaining yet because the subject was so large that every answer opened 3 more questions, which was exactly the condition he found most satisfying. He had checked out 2 books from the library on the way out. He had also, he told me, organized his library card by putting it in his shirt pocket instead of his jacket pocket because shirt pockets were more accessible during active research. I made a note of that too, in the private catalog I kept in my head of the things Jonah did that I didn't want to forget. My grant cycle reached its final review stage in late June. I had completed the evaluation of all 14 applications. The rubric assigned weighted scores across 4 categories: demonstrated public benefit, financial accountability, curriculum alignment with district standards, and evidence of ongoing need within the district. I had applied the rubric consistently to each file, the same categories, the same weight distribution, the same documentation standards I applied every year. The 4 programs with the strongest public benefit cases were a summer reading program serving families, where over 80% of participants qualified for free and reduced lunch, a STEM exploratory lab, offering open enrollment to all district students regardless of household income, with active outreach in the district's 3 lowest-income elementary schools, a bilingual academic transition program for recently arrived families, designed specifically for students who needed grade-level catch-up in English, and a school year tutoring program embedded in 4 district schools with the lowest standardized assessment outcomes. These 4 programs had clear, documented cases for why public funding was necessary for them to operate at all. Without the district grant, the reading program would reduce its hours. The STEM lab would lose its outreach coordinator. The bilingual program would cap enrollment. The tutoring program would cut sites. The Maplecrest program would also be impacted by non-renewal. But the Maplecrest program served families who had paid $850 per child without subsidy in previous years, and whose enrollment decisions were driven by program quality, not by whether a matching grant was available. The public benefit case was the weakest in the cycle, by a measurable margin. Its score fell below the funding threshold. I completed the ranking on a Thursday afternoon and finalized the decisions on Friday. 7 programs received funding. 7 received non-renewal letters. I drafted all 7 letters using the district's standard language. Each letter explained the prioritization criteria, noted that the decision was made on the basis of consistent evaluation, and provided information about the February reapplication window. The Maplecrest letter was the 4th one I drafted. I signed my name at the bottom. On Tuesday morning, I printed the final copies, initialed the cover sheets, sealed the envelopes, and placed them in the outgoing mail tray. I went back to my desk and opened the next file in my queue. I finished my coffee. If you are still with me right now, I want to stop and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone draw a circle around a group of people and leave one person outside it, and had to decide whether to say something or let the situation reveal itself in its own time? Drop your answer in the comments. I read all of them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. There is still a significant piece of this story left, and the quietest part is the one that matters most. Stay with me. Somewhere in the middle of June, between a Wednesday afternoon compliance review and a Thursday morning staff meeting about the fall grant cycle timeline, I stopped waiting for my mother to realize what she had done. This is not as simple as it sounds. I had been carrying a very specific kind of hope for months, not the hope that she would apologize, not the hope that she would reconsider, but the particular stubborn hope that the weight of the evidence would eventually become undeniable to her. That she would see the pattern I could see clearly from where I was standing. That she would understand, without me having to name it, what the Maplecrest decision had communicated to my son about his place in her ledger. People like my mother do not arrive at conclusions by evidence. They arrive at them, when they arrive at them at all, by consequence. I had been cataloging evidence and pointing it at someone who was not equipped to read it. That was not the same as changing anything. I was not going to argue Jonah into the circle. I was going to do my job correctly, and I was going to build my son a summer worth having, and I was going to do both things without waiting for permission or recognition. The work would speak in its own time, to the people equipped to hear it. That was the shift. It looked like a Thursday morning at my desk, and a cup of coffee, and a file pulled from the priority queue. It was the difference between hoping someone would see and doing the thing you needed to do, regardless of whether they ever did. The Maplecrest letter arrived at Philip Oakes's office in the second week of July. He called the district office within 3 days. My assistant forwarded the inquiry to me as a routine administrative follow-up. I called Oakes back the same afternoon. He was professional. He was also clearly frustrated in the way that people are frustrated when a decision affects something they have built. He asked if the denial could be reconsidered, whether the evaluation criteria had shifted from the prior cycle, whether there was a pathway to supplemental review. I explained that the evaluation rubric had not changed, that the program's score reflected the consistent application of the prioritization criteria, and that the primary gap was in the public benefit case, specifically, the absence of documented outreach to economically underserved families, and the lack of any sliding scale or scholarship mechanism. I told him the reapplication window opened in February. I suggested, directly, that addressing the public benefit section would significantly improve the program's score in the next cycle. He thanked me. He sounded, at the end of the call, like someone who had received disappointing but honest information and knew the difference between those two things. I respected that. The Arrowhead Club ran all of July. The watershed thread had grown to include a field project. Addie had obtained permission from the Parks Department for the group to do a creek bank observation study in the nature preserve 2 miles from the library, and they spent 4 Tuesdays in late July taking water samples and drawing maps and arguing, productively, about the difference between a tributary and a branch. Jonah's library card had been used to check out 19 books by mid-July. He had started keeping a notebook. My mother called on a Thursday evening in late July. She had heard from Claudia about the grant situation. Her voice, when she opened the call, had the specific quality of controlled outrage, very still, very organized, each word placed carefully in its exact position. "I understand you made the grant decision regarding Maplecrest," she said. "I did," I said. "I'd like to understand the basis for that decision." I told her the same thing I had told Philip Oakes: the prioritization rubric, the public benefit evaluation, the ranking against competing applications, the budget constraints. I told her the Maplecrest program had scored below the funding threshold based on criteria that were applied consistently to every program in the cycle. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her organizing her response. "You're telling me," she said, very carefully, "that this was a standard administrative decision?" "Yes," I said, "it was." Another pause. She was looking for the place in what I'd said where she could push back, where she could find the seam and open it. There wasn't one. The decision was documented. It was on paper. It was made by a rubric that predated my mother's enrollment of her grandchildren by 5 years. There was nothing to dispute. "I see," she said. Those 2 words did more than an argument would have done. They said, "I understand what happened." They also said, "I cannot say what I would like to say about it," and they left the rest, the real conversation, the one neither of us was going to have directly, in the specific, uncomfortable silence between us. "Thank you for explaining," she said, and she hung up. The fallout from there was quiet and slow, the way things settle when nobody is willing to name the shape of what they're settling from. Claudia called once more in early August. She said she understood why I had made the decision I had made, and she hoped we could move forward. I told her I hoped so too. Marcus sent an email asking, in a tone of neutral inquiry, whether the grant criteria were publicly available. I replied with a link to the district's published evaluation rubric. He did not reply to that. My mother sent Jonah a birthday card in September with $20 inside. He used it to buy 2 used books at the library's annual sale, a field guide to North American raptors, and a history of cartography that the Arrowhead Club had been waiting for. He was pleased with both. He thanked my mother in a handwritten card, which I helped him mail. It was a nice card. He meant it sincerely, which is the kind of thing about Jonah that makes him very hard to be cynical around. We had Thanksgiving at my parents' house. It was fine, the kind of fine that has work behind it, where everyone has made a decision to be civil and is honoring that decision carefully. The turkey was good. Jonah talked to Tasha about kestrels for 20 minutes after dinner, and she told him she had learned about birds of prey at the Maplecrest program. He asked her what she had learned. They compared notes. It was one of the better 20 minutes of the evening. In February, the Maplecrest program submitted a reapplication. The new application included a scholarship fund covering 15% of enrollment, a sliding scale fee structure for families qualifying under the district's eligibility guidelines, and a formal outreach partnership with 2 elementary schools in the district's lowest income neighborhoods. Philip Oakes had written a new public benefit narrative that was substantially more rigorous than the prior application. The program scored above the funding threshold. I approved it. If you can be fair to a situation that was not fair to you, you should be. This is not forgiveness, and it is not forgetting. It is a belief that the work should be done correctly, regardless of who benefits from it, because the moment you begin making grant decisions based on anything other than the rubric, you have stopped doing your job and started doing something else. I know what I am. I know what I do. I was not going to compromise either of those things because of a Thursday evening phone call in April. The Arrowhead Club ran its full summer and then converted to an after-school reading group in September, meeting twice a week in the library's back corner where the specialist collections lived. They had identified 9 migratory bird species, completed the watershed study with a report that Addie submitted to the Parks Department, and were halfway through a hand-drawn atlas of Arborfield that they were building from historical maps and current satellite images, which Jonah had sourced from the library's digital archive access. His notebook had 43 pages of field notes. His library card was so worn by the time school started that the laminate had peeled completely from one corner, and the ink on the magnetic strip was beginning to fade. He asked me if he could get a new one. I told him he could, anytime he wanted. I kept the old one. It is in my desk drawer at home, under the grant evaluation rubrics, and the reapplication tracking spreadsheets, and the color-coded flags I use to mark priority items. I cannot tell you exactly why I kept it, except that it is the evidence of a summer my son built for himself, with a librarian who believed in him, and a Tuesday morning, and a question he had not answered yet. It is proof that the thing my mother tried to purchase for 6 children, access, investment, the signal that they were worth it, is not actually for sale. You cannot buy your grandchild's curiosity. You can only make room for it or fill the room with something else. My mother had looked at my son and decided he was not worth $850 of her money. She had drawn the line based on a judgment about his academic fitness that she had no actual basis to make. I had looked at the program she chose and found, by the consistent application of a fair standard, that it did not qualify for public support in its current form. We had both used the criteria available to us. Mine were attached to a job description, a budget line, and 7 years of institutional knowledge about what public investment is supposed to do. Hers were attached to a preference she had dressed up as concern for her grandson's well-being. That is not the same kind of decision, but it is the same kind of documentation. And I am very thorough with documentation. That is my story. If there is one thing I want to leave you with, it is this. The most powerful thing you sometimes have is not a confrontation. It is not a document produced at the right moment in front of a watching crowd. It is a rubric, applied fairly, by someone who does not need to be seen applying it. The work does not require an audience. It requires accuracy. Take this as your sign that you do not need to argue for your child in a room that has already made up its mind. You need to build the room they deserve, one Tuesday at a time, and trust that a child who is given the right questions will find their own answers regardless of who drew the circle they were left outside of. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are more of these, and none of them have to shout to be heard. Let me tell you about the open house, because it is a chapter I have thought about more than once since everything settled. Claudia called me the week after my mother's call to let me know that the Maplecrest program was holding a spring open house for enrolled families and prospective families. She said I was welcome to attend. There was a particular gentleness in how she said it, a gentleness that people use when they are trying to soften the shape of a decision that has already been made. And it told me that my mother had framed the situation to Claudia as something I might still choose differently if I had more information. As if I needed to see the program in person to understand its value. As if the problem was that I did not yet know what Maplecrest was. I went. I drove myself on a Friday afternoon in early May, and I walked through the converted fellowship hall, and I let Philip Oakes show me the curriculum materials. He was a good educator, in the specific way that good educators are good. He was genuinely interested in the thing he had built, and that interest was contagious, in a way that made the program feel more alive than its brochure. The logic module used real puzzles, not simplified versions. The legal structures section had actual sample contracts and small claims court forms, and the kind of practical document literacy that Jonah would have consumed in 2 days and then asked for more. I thought, standing at the writing station, about Jonah's 45-minute explanation of the nitrogen cycle to my mother's neighbor. I thought about what he would do with a module on how to read a contract. Claudia found me near the book display. She said, quietly, that she hoped I wasn't too upset about things, that my mother's heart was in the right place. I said I knew. She said she thought Jonah might be ready for something like this in a year or two, and that she would be happy to advocate for him. I told her I appreciated that, which was true, and I thanked Philip Oakes for his time, and I drove home. I did not feel what I think Claudia expected me to feel, which was chastened, or grateful, or newly appreciative of the program's quality. I felt clear. I felt the specific clarity that comes when you have been handed someone else's explanation for something and have recognized that the explanation does not account for the actual facts. The actual fact was, my son was 9 years old and more capable of focused academic work than any of the 6 grandchildren his grandmother had enrolled in a selective academic program. The actual fact was, my mother had made a judgment call about his fitness using a private ledger she had been keeping for years, and the judgment was wrong, and she was not going to revise it because I made a case for it. The only revision available was the one I could make in my own domain. I went home and looked at my son's library card, still in his jacket pocket where he had left it when he came home from school. I picked up the phone and called Addie Barrow. July came, and with it a particular heat that settled over Arborfield like a held breath. The Maplecrest program was halfway through its summer session. My mother mentioned it twice in phone calls, each time in the context of something one of the other grandchildren had said or done. A debate Tasha had won in the logic module, a short story Lily had written for the writing component. I listened and said the appropriate things. I did not mention the Arrowhead Club, not because I was keeping it from anyone, but because it felt private, in a way that I wanted to protect a little longer. What was happening in that library on Tuesdays and Fridays was not the kind of thing that fit in a family phone call. It was the kind of thing that unfolds across a summer in the small, specific ways that matter to the person it is happening to. Jonah had moved from the Pacific Kestrel to a broader study of falconry in medieval Europe, because the Arrowhead Club had been reading about historical uses of raptors, and he had found a thread he could not drop. He had checked out a book from the Interlibrary Loan System, a book that had to be requested from another branch because the Arborfield Library didn't have it in its collection, and he had read it in 3 evenings and taken 4 pages of notes in his notebook, which had now grown to 62 pages of observations, drawings, and questions. The questions were the best part. Jonah kept a running list on the last page of his notebook of the questions he had not yet answered. In July, the list had 14 items on it. I read it once when he left the notebook on the kitchen table, not because I was prying, but because he had left it open, and because I wanted to know what lived at the edge of his knowing. The questions ranged from the technical, how do raptors adjust for wind resistance in a stoop, to the philosophical, if you train an animal to return to you, Does it return because of trust or because of habit, and is there a difference? He was 9 years old. He had arrived at questions that some people spend their whole lives not thinking to ask. I thought about this when my mother called in July, after the grant letter had arrived at the Maplecrest office. I thought about it during the controlled outrage call, when she was very still and organized and precise about her displeasure. I thought about it during the specific silence that followed, "I see," and "Thank you for explaining." I did not bring up the Arrowhead Club. I did not tell her about the 62 pages of notes or the interlibrary loan or the 14 open questions at the back of the notebook. Some things are worth protecting from the people who would not see them correctly. I will tell you something about the month of August, because August is when the story started to find its edges. The Maplecrest program ran its final session weeks and then sent families their end-of-year materials. A portfolio of work from each child's participation, a summary of skills covered, a certificate of completion. Claudia sent me a photograph of Sam's portfolio with a message that said the program had been wonderful and she hoped we could find something like it for Jonah next year. I thanked her. I said I would look into it. The Arrowhead Club did not produce a certificate of completion. It produced, in early August, a group presentation that Addie organized in the library's community room. 7 children, and Jonah standing in front of a hand-drawn display board they had made together, covering the 3 research threads: birds, watersheds, maps, with the field notes and diagrams and questions they had accumulated over the summer. They had invited their parents. Sean and I sat in the 3rd row. Jonah presented the Kestrel section and the falconry history and the open question about trust versus habit, and he presented it with the confidence of someone who has spent a summer following a real question somewhere real. Afterward, Addie told me, quietly, at the door, while the children were eating the cookies someone had brought, that Jonah was one of the most naturally rigorous young thinkers she had worked with in 19 years. She said it the way librarians say true things, plainly, without ceremony, as a simple piece of information she thought I should have. I thanked her. I thanked her in the way you thank someone who has given your child something that cannot be purchased or enrolled in. Then I went home and made dinner and did not cry until much later, when Sean was asleep and the house was quiet, and even then, it was not grief so much as the release of something I had been holding very carefully all summer. Jonah asked me once, in late August, if he was going to a program like the one his cousins went to next year. He asked it in the same tone he asked factual questions, interested, waiting for the answer, not anxious about it. I told him I didn't know yet. I told him whatever we did, we would make sure it was good. He nodded and went back to his book. He did not ask me why his cousins had gone to that program, and he had not. I think he knew. Children understand more of the shape of things than we give them credit for. I think he had decided, in whatever way 9-year-olds make these decisions, that it was not his to carry, that it was adult business, and he had bird questions that were more interesting than adult business. He was right.